In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on basic human rights and or freedoms originating from individualist anarchists, whom are often the most vocal in contributing and or communicating clearly the best recommendations that have advanced basic human rights and or freedoms, concerned often most with individual autonomy and or privacy, with the most preliminary meaningful concern. The individual anarchist, including myself, is often originating with a concern to engage more responsible, meaningful work freely within the liberations of one's own freedoms to think and or engage creative conducts. The most creative thinkers have more universalizably been individuals whom are individualist anarchists, whom have committed to more responsible duty of care to engage the self-conducted learning and or self-disciplining of one's self-conducted learning pursuits within the courses of elaborating the complexities of one's self-knowledge and or self-awareness to ultimately know thy existencia. Optimizing one's freedoms that are more central to one's values, needing to engage more responsible domain-specific conducts within what's objectively, ultimately valid and or true and or meaningful to allowance for freedoms, be it that one is engaging the negligent, irresponsible will to no effect, lacks will, engages more irrational and or irresponsible and or in some cases non-responsible misconducts and or invalid conducts inappropriate to constitute one's freedoms and or impairs and or threatens and or results in deficits and or deficiencies and or disabilities within one's basic human rights and or freedoms in some cases, and are always more likely compared to the individual anarchist, whom is individualistic in terms of undertaking the voluntary suffering and or responsibility that satisfying uniquely the necessarily necessary conditions, never the unnecessarily unnecessary conditions imposed by the harmful totalitarian wrongful convictions of the Platos, whom are the individuals who think Plato was correct in terms of his social constructivism, not uniquely his thinking in terms of subjugating your existencia to others in order to engage the imitations of the best conducts of others, instead to uniquely be more like the Aristotles, whom perceive the best conducts in others and or even judge and or criticize those conducts, yet may appropriate certain of the best gold standard practices as it's meaningful to liberate one's own mind, engaging instead original thinking and or meaningful conducts from engaging the self-conducted learning and or self-disciplining to contribute something of true original value to society, engaging meaningful work and or whom are more productive and or meaningfully concerned to provide clear communications on basic human rights and or freedoms in order to live a meaningful life. Plato never philosophized on living a meaningful life. This was not one of Plato's concerns. He was concerned with often criminals whom would violate crimes unlawfully and whom needed to be subjugated and or ultimately dominated and or ruled. as they had ill wills, needing slavery in order to allowance for a utopic vision that is intrinsically totalitarian. Plato most certainly held certain totalitarian personality characteristics, evident in terms of his philosophizing on subjugation, asking individuals to subjugate themselves, to treat all heterosexual men and or boys as women and or girls whom prefer to be subordinate to men and or boys whom are more likely to be submissive. Instead of engaging original communications and or thinking for oneself, orthogonal to thinking like another whom is successful, not to think like oneself. It's bad to think like oneself, Plato would think. It's better to think like the better individual, whom is the best. Yet one may not truly hold the wisdom to hold the self-knowledge and or self-awareness that that individual is the best. Had everybody claimed that that individual is the best, may have difficulty to distinguish the certain areas one's expertise, even within a certain self-conducted learning pursuit and or self-disciplining, may be blind to distinct laws and or dynamics that are invalid to be providing certain erroneous truth claims. For example, one may think that one is an expert on mind-body connections, yet is trained uniquely in psychology with little self-knowledge and or self-awareness into philosophy and or philosophizing and or neuroscience, to instead communicate erroneously that you need not hold any meaningful knowledge into certain causations of the brain. All causations are unique to one's subjectivity and or may not communicate whatsoever on certain causations. Instead, may be more concerned with certain correlations, connecting just world beliefs to cynicism, and the distinctions in terms of the polarities of just world beliefs on one end of a continuum and or cynicism on the other. Individuals who may engage in more fair treatment and or whom say are more equitable in their approach to justice are more likely to hold just world beliefs, thinking that be it one treats another individual justly is more likely to be treated fairly, and or should deserve to be treated fairly. Had one not been treated fairly, would constitute a violation of basic human rights and or freedoms, compared to the individual whom is more cynical and or likely to think that another individual whom is engaging in the inappropriate violations of another individual's basic human rights and or freedoms is engaging more ethical conducts, as the other individual is a sucker for not necessarily truly being able to see that the most benefits are allowanced within lying, cheating, and manipulating without needing to engage the responsible conducts. Otherwise, one is ultimately engaging what is most slavish without necessarily constituting the slave ethic within one's vague perceptions, as one whom is enduring difficult, responsible conducts, may endure those conducts to have the benefits they may have been promised stripped from them by the liars, cheats, and thieves, whom are correct for being liars, cheats, and thieves, without needing to endure the same difficult burdens, engaging the instant gratifications of hedonic, positive, meaningless feelings, lacking true meaning and affect, to instead hold bitter resentments and or the cynical view that life is inherently, intrinsically meaningless, and there's nothing truly that is worth living other than lying, cheating, and stealing for the immediate positive benefits you experience for a short time, and then it's gone forever. Compared to the individual whom is more likely to treat other individuals fairly, thinking that had one treated other fairly more consistently and or with the appropriate duty of care, other individuals with a more compassionate conscience would evaluate that individual within their consciousness, aware of these gooder deeds, to think one should be more cooperative for the maximizing of mutual benefit, providing the most optimal benefits consistently and or providing the contributions unique to cooperation that would not otherwise exist, and or allowance for us to live in buildings and or fly planes and or go on the exciting, thrilling roller coaster rides in amusement parks, as the individuals whom are the cynics tend to be the homeless criminals on the streets, whom have difficulty even engaging meaningful work, depriving others of the benefits for their own maladaptive, self-inflicted woes, harming their being, and are often more likely to cripple and or impair and or shorten their life course, dying earlier with shorter lifespans, ultimately, compared to individuals whom are more cooperative, optimistic, and or altruistic, whom are more enduring and or cognizant of the violations of others, and are more likely to be higher in just world beliefs, engaging the conducts that allow us for more freedom and or creative problem solving and or conflict resolutions, that allowance for freedoms, and not just freedoms for the self, the abundance of freedoms that one cultivates, the self-virtues of abundance, that allowance for the emergence of original and or new and or different tools and or technologies to live in the innovative, inventive buildings and or access the most recent smart device that engages multifunctions, allowing you to draw images, engage live visual phone calls from your smart device and or tablet, and or engage in future-oriented iterations of smart technology, perhaps entire telegrams that reconstruct an individual from digitized, projected photons in terms of holograms. Individuals may be able to sit with you at breakfast and hold a discussion without necessarily being there, from the remodeling of the visual image of that individual into four-dimensional space-time. Yet the individual whom is within their expertise uniquely a psychologist may not be able to engage the appropriate philosophizing and or provide valid and or fair communications in terms of, be it one testifies as an expert witness within a court case that would otherwise violate an individual's basic human rights and or freedoms, providing unlawful evidence from an erroneous study and or irrelevant evidence from a distinct field, inappropriate to evaluate, say, injury to one's executive function, that may concern more a neuroscientist and or a philosopher whom is philosophizing in terms of certain issues related to responsible conduct, irresponsible conduct, and or non-responsible conduct within one's discourses, having written and recorded and or published communications on future-oriented risk and or benefit evaluations associated with the causations of criminality and or more personal responsibility within allowancing more freedoms, engaging the cultivations of allowances and or avoiding the disallowances and or misconducts to practice the optimizing conducts more likely to result in more altruistic, compassionate conducts that uniquely satisfy certain relevant and or meaningful psychological needs to optimize subjective well-being for the self and or others. Instead of what the psychologist may be concerned with in terms of providing some sort of ideological communication in terms of their input in terms of just world beliefs and or cynicism that may be irrelevant and or invalid in terms of an individual who may be suffering from a disease of mind resulting from brain injury and or brain trauma that an individual may be non-responsible for. And therefore, there's a concern with the guilty mind and or to constitute the guilty misconducts from constituting the guilty self, that an individual may not be able to constitute the guilty self had one's subjectivity not being responsible for the brain trauma that results in a criminal offense. Yet, be it an individual is cognizant and or may be using the brain trauma to avoid a worse outcome, yet is still within what one is cognizant of and or deliberates and or premeditates even within a near and or far short-term deliberation, having perhaps impairments in terms of long-term evaluations that may diminish some responsibility in terms of sentencing compared to what otherwise may excuse and or justify an individual receiving medical treatment for their brain trauma and or injury instead of any meaningful criminal sanction, to treat compassionately the underlying psychological needs relevant to the case, never violating due process. The Platos tend to think that certain experts are superior and may provide meaningful communications on nearly any topic without necessarily holding the appropriate credentials and or clear communications to constitute valid and or psychological truth claims that are inherently and or intrinsically more meaningful than other individuals, compared to individuals whom have a more keen eye and are better at detecting even the individuals whom are non-experts, whom are holding certain meaningful similarities in terms of credentials, and yet may engage in original instantiations that provide clear, objective communications on the best evidence that other individuals are ignoring and have contributed to more meaningful advancements in society directly and or indirectly without necessarily being recognized for those, are more likely to be individuals whom treat other individuals justly and or fairly and or with compassion instead of empathy, whom are the free thinkers and are liberators of minds, whom advance basic human rights and or freedoms, compared to the Platos whom are concerned with subjugating and or limiting your basic human rights and freedoms, in need often for treatment themselves of the chronic disease plaguing their psyches, from the vagnesses and or supernaturalisms and or superstitions within their own thinkings that truly are inappropriate and or disproportionate to judge what is most meaningful in optimizing the intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, to be more cognizant in decreasing the intracategorical and or intercategorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies. Individualist anarchists most meaningfully are concerned with basic human rights and or freedoms, communicating clearly and or original thinking from the best practices and or best evidence, to uniquely stick to the best facts and or best evidence and or gold standard practices to liberate one's existentia with the truth. And it's the truth that's most meaningful to being a individualist anarchist, whom is a lover of truth and a lover of wisdom. Meaningfully, most meaningful to philosophize is the philosophizer whom engages the flashlight illuminations with the sample size illuminated from the limitations of knowledge one is cognizant of. One may not truly be able to see 160 degrees, yet a sample size may be needed to satisfy the as it must be good enough and necessary conditions, illuminations of a sample within a navigation towards the satisfaction of certain essential psychological needs, needs some illumination and or needs not the illumination of 160 degrees in order to satisfy the certain underlying psychological need to optimize the appropriate intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies without constituting counterproductive, irrational thinking that amps up the volume on the intracategorical and or intercategorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies, ultimately more counterproductive and or harming an individual's volitions within the navigation's willful, constituting the irresponsible misconducts impairing the will and or ultimately resulting in the lack of willfulness, compared to their counterparts, whom are the luminaries concerned with engaging the appropriate illuminations to illuminate their own conducts in terms of satisfying the meaningful underlying meaningfulness criteria, combinative of internal and or external validity as to what works and works meaningfully, combined with the ultimate psychological truths of existentia, with the meaningfulness one most needs to engage creative thinking and or creative problem solving, resolving the relevant and or meaningful appropriate issues with elaborate detailed communications that are inherently meaningful, not meaningless. Be it was meaningless, one may only be sputtering out useless pointlessnesses aimlessly of facts with the mumbo jumbos that communicate what are truly conducting no better than one's own selfish consolidations of certain cognitions, with more misconducts on the periphery harming other individuals who need meaningful, essential information. The defectors whom are truly engaging in misconducts, perceiving conducts within what is providing a partial benefit in terms of increasing one's intellect, yet severely impairs the intellect, otherwise allowance from meaningful thinking, and meaningful thinking that resolves issues to connect the meaningfulness to internal and or external validity and or the ultimate psychological truths of existence, appropriate to resolve issues and or creative problems, or creative solutions to problems, to resolve conflicts, building on the intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, with a keen eye to avoid and or proactively mitigate and or prevent the intracategorical and or intercategorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies, to allowance for more meaningfulness within one's existentia, within the cognizance that is relevant and or appropriate, unique to the rational, appropriate judging of one's self-knowledge and or self-awareness, not communicating meaningless facts and or evidence that is irrelevant to resolving the needs of the situation within what's contemporaneous to the momentariness of one's experiential encounters, needing certain more clear, responsible conducts to liberate oneself from engaging more meaningful living within meaningful optimisms that think one may be able to resolve X conflict and or X problem, to identify correctly the necessary conditions needed to satisfy to resolve the issue, constituting what works, not what does not work and or is counterproductive. Be it that one is a genius yet is truly not a genius for sitting in their bed all day and or consuming information without actually factually meaningfully providing any benefit and or solutions to the woes that they complain about, where they may meaningfully engage certain tasks to resolve those issues with the brain power that they waste in terms of investing time in the wrong intellectual pursuits, instead of engaging the more meaningful, relevant, and appropriate needs that they may be neglecting. That is what liberates minds, and that the individualistic anarchist is most meaning as one is communicating to others to free their thinking, to for themselves be more cognizant of their own current to future oriented demands within the persona that is naming the self, the names of the feely-weelies, truly holding certain negative meaning and affect that are the pangs of existentia, depriving an individual of what is meaningful, in need of certain satisfactions in order to experience the meaningfulness within one's existentia, that frees one to engage more creative conflict resolutions within the explorations responsibly conducted, future-oriented to the evaluations of uniquely the domain-specific best practices and or best self-knowledge and or self-awareness, to think for oneself from the best examples and or think how the best examples inferred the inferences they had inferred, to cultivate one's own unique thinking and or more likely is one's unique thinking from one's own inference without true, meaningful, valid access to another's subjectivity, to hold the self-knowledge and or self-wisdom, yet to engage the step-by-step approaches most likely to allowance for the insightful streams of thought that liberate minds from the disciplining of the best practices and or best approaches that may, from one's unique self that is within one's subjectivity, influenced by certain underlying conductions of the nervous system within mind-body connections, as individuals truly hold distinct epigenomes with distinct sets of meaningful information that are influenced from direct perception that ultimately result in distinct perspectival processes, and be it one undergoes the responsible duty of care to conduct themselves more meaningfully and engage creative problem solving, will infer distinct problems and or perspectives within even the same problems, and or approaches to the best practices that allowance for trailblazing to distinct self-conducted disciplining of what's meaningful to positively contribute original ideas, had one meaningfully engaged meaningful work to liberate one's own mind and or provide a value to society that is unique, expanding the valuability of one's being in terms of the valiant, meaningful contributions that the individualist anarchist uniquely contributes that the collectivist never does, as the collectivist is more concerned with the social constructivisms that subjugate the self and or inhibit and or impair originality, resulting in more disabilities and or deficiencies and or criminality that are more likely to result in totalitarianism from the subjugations and or inappropriate communications that expect individuals to engage in what the other demands of them instead of liberating their minds and or undertaking the voluntary suffering and or responsibilidade to satisfy truly the necessarily necessary conditions in order for one to allowance freedoms, avoiding keenly the counterproductive, unnecessary conditions that are what the totalitarians desire you to misconduct, to harm yourself and or others, yet to claim that this would be a benefit to others and or yourself, be it that you are often experiencing negative feely-weelies that are indicating that's incorrect, that often arise from overemphasizing empathy instead of compassionate, problem-oriented resolutions to those problems, instead of problem-focused coping that reiterates the issue over and over again instead of proactively attempting to resolve the problem, to engage the empathy of the woes instead of the wows. That's a solution that may work. Instead, woe is me. Why is he still trying to do that thing that I told him not to do, as he's going to end up in a psychiatric ward for thinking original thoughts that may truly be schizophrenia without oneself holding the appropriate experience to diagnose meaningfully the symptomologies of schizophrenia, be it the individual whom is engaging truthfully original thinking is reading books and or communicating what one thinks is the best practices from what has worked and or is tried and true, yet other individuals within society in the most judged to be the best George Timothy, the seventh in command, whom is always praised for his perceived due diligence, yet everybody holds the self-knowledge and or self-awareness that he fondles little boys and or engages in misconducts with concubines, though no one is permitted to communicate this publicly, as it is a sin within the Platonic code. He's contributed certain truthful, meaningful communications on what had been the best practices. And George Timothy the seventh, whom is truthfully a scoundrel, compared to the original, whom is the individualist anarchist, whom is being stigmatized for engaging original creative thinking, inferring certain issues with George Timothy the seventh, having a track record for claiming his best practices always work beyond 100%, yet upon statistical analysis is discovered to work 46% of the time, with errors resulting from certain misconducts that he holds the self-knowledge and or self-awareness, yet masks to hold his reputation. And so the original is thinking on a better solution to resolve the issue, communicating certain violations within the best practices, violating due process in certain areas that infringe upon another individual's individual autonomy and or privacy, with inappropriate surveillance of individuals prior existing to committing crimes, whom are learned about from intimate others, per se, thinking and or communicating within experiences of perhaps mistreatment that, oh, I should do X misconduct, yet may have no other self-knowledge and or self-awareness to rationally, within proportionate judging of the evidence, infer that individual to meet a rational expectation would otherwise commit a unlawful offense, resulting in more negligence and or mistreatments of crime, increasing wrongful convictions and or the spike in crime rate from individuals being frustrated in terms of holding the self-knowledge and or self-awareness of the violations into basic human rights and or freedoms. George Timothy the seventh is most responsible for from the precedent he's helped to influence and or the unlawful laws legislated in his name, with statues erected to celebrate the contributions of his sexual misconducts that you are not allowed to communicate in public, compared to the original, whom is attempting to liberate the minds of other individuals from their mind-body connections, communicating, look, there's a problem. There are these serious injustices, and we hold the self-knowledge and or self-awareness as to why. We're violating individuals' basic human rights and freedoms with unlawful surveillance prior existing to due process within court, prior existing to being sentenced for a crime and or even found guilty. Some individuals who have never prior existing been found guilty of a crime are surveilled and then found guilty of a crime for thinking about engaging certain misconducts and or in some cases pressured into engaging misconducts from the individuals whom are surveilling them and or providing tips to nudge individuals into committing crimes, to not waste the police officer's time in terms of the surveillance that one spends countless time and or effort wasting their own time and or resources thinking that they're engaging in positive contributions, yet engaging counterproductive violations of basic human rights and freedoms, and are engaging what's inherently, intrinsically bad and or should be themselves found guilty of a crime, violating other individuals' basic human rights and or freedoms. That the scoundrel George Thomasy VII protects those individuals, saying, well, why don't you just evaluate the evidence? Within his vagueness, communicating clearly what you're claiming to be violations of individuals' basic human rights and freedoms would otherwise allowance criminals to be let free without considering that those individuals are not criminals and truly are stamped the label of criminality from being pressured by police officers whom are the true criminals engaging in violations of basic human rights and or freedoms and are more likely to hold certain totalitarian personality characteristics, conducting the same misconducts the totalitarians do, which is surveillance of citizens whom one does not have the appropriate warrants and or excuse and or justifications to constitute the infringements of an individual's individual autonomy and or privacy, within surveilling individuals that they pressure into committing crimes they would not otherwise commit. That is in the intrinsic motivations of George Thomasy VII, whom is a scoundrel, more likely to be intrinsically motivated by the false esteem and or reputation he's allowanced with monetary value provided, in some cases, gifts by individuals for his supposed contributions. Yet most individuals fear him, thinking amongst the women and girls that they may be violated and or experience certain sexual misconducts from his history of engaging sexual misconducts, often from insecurities and or violations, holding the troubled conscience of his unethical violation of individuals' human rights and or freedoms. He holds certain self-knowledge and or self-awareness of certain cases. He's directly and or indirectly contributed to wrongful convictions of individuals whom would not have otherwise committed certain crimes had a police officer not pressured them, and the police officer told them, in perhaps a case, that they had paid the individual to commit a crime after preventing them from being able to engage meaningful work and needing the money to afford rent, resulting in ultimately what an individual felt entrapped to misconduct with no way out, ultimately taking their life upon being sentenced for life in prison for a robbery. Within experiencing the fear in the heat of the moment, took the life of another individual, feeling guilty, experiencing even symptoms of chronic illness and or being diagnosed with cancer shortly after, that plagued the conscience of George Thomasy VII, intrinsically motivating the observer, whom is the individualist anarchist concerned with liberating basic human rights and our freedoms, from doing justice to the evidence and judging appropriately what's most meaningful within due process, not violating due process, and or constituting arbitrary laws, imitating the totalitarians, whom are the biggest advocates for surveillance and or unlawful surveillance without warrant, violating the basic human rights and or freedoms of individual autonomy and or, by the way, privacy is a basic human right and freedom, in case you did not know, be it that you are more totalitarian in terms of your personality characteristics. You should not engage in surveillance and or therefore should treat your totalitarianism, respecting other people's privacy and or being more cognizant and or careful in terms of other individuals' individual autonomy and or privacy, to engage the more responsible conducts instead of the misconducts, mistreating other individuals appropriately, would provide more meaningful benefit to others ethically. Be it that you desire to experience more freedoms within your existencia, you should conduct the meaningful work domain specific to infer the best practices and or the best criticisms of those best practices within what is uniquely internally and or externally valid and or psychologically true and or meaningful. Meaningful meaning that you can elaborate and or engage more complex, meaningful navigations that you can actually factually comprehend with certain probabilistic inferences into what's most likely to work, not necessarily be counterproductive and or not work, yet holding self-knowledge and or self-awareness of the counterproductive misconducts is meaningful to inform your own navigations in terms of the most meaningful misconducts and or practices to avoid self-harm practices, and to uniquely engage the self-care practices that are more likely to engage the meta practices, optimizing your own thinking in terms of engaging critical thinking skills, to be more cognizant of various fallacies and or vagueness within your cognizing of complex philosophizing. That within your responsible desire to engage the liberations of yourself may inspire other individuals to liberate themselves as you aspire to uniquely what is most meaningful to your unique pursuits and or meaningful concerns that should be altruistic and or provide some contribution to society within connecting what is within your unique aptitudes and or talents to provide meaningful, clear communications that can benefit other individuals from spreading awareness and or contributing to what already works and or optimizing what already works to optimize the internal and or external living conditions of individuals' subjective well-being. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keeping those acepçãdades.